A man in his late 50s sits alone at his kitchen table at 5:40 in the morning. The house is still dark except for the small lamp above the stove. He is doing a crossword puzzle in pen, not pencil, because he never needs to erase anything. Coffee sits untouched beside him, going cold the way it always does. On the counter behind him is a stack of library books on physics, jazz history, and Reconstruction-era politics. His grandchildren's drawings are taped to the refrigerator, slightly crooked, exactly how he left them. He will finish the puzzle in 11 minutes, the same way he has almost every morning for 30 years. From the outside, a scene like this is easy enough to interpret. Most people would look at him and see an older man with a quiet, uneventful life. Maybe they would assume he never had bigger ambitions, or that he simply settled into routine. Some would guess he is a retired worker, content but unremarkable, filling his mornings with small distractions. Society tends to place a very specific label on black men of his generation who keep to themselves. Quiet, reserved, unassuming, not particularly exceptional. But that interpretation may be missing something important. The problem is that the same quiet behavior can mean something completely different from what people assume. The world sees an ordinary man doing an ordinary puzzle before an ordinary day begins. But sometimes what looks like simplicity is actually a mind that has spent decades learning to hide its own intensity. People see modesty, but sometimes modesty is armor, built by a man who learned early that being visibly brilliant could be dangerous. And this is not some abstract person you have never encountered. You probably know someone who fits this description, even if you never noticed it before. Maybe it's your uncle, the one who always wins every argument but rarely starts one. Maybe it's your father's old coworker, the one everyone quietly called the smart one behind his back. Maybe it's a neighbor who fixes everyone's appliances without ever mentioning his engineering background. These are black men born roughly between 1965 and 1980, carrying intellects that were often measured but rarely celebrated. And if you want to understand him, you have to look at the world he created when nobody else was watching. His home is organized with a precision most visitors never notice at first glance. Every book on his shelf is arranged by subject, then by year, then by how often he returns to it. His record collection moves from Coltrane to Mingus to obscure live recordings almost nobody else owns. He keeps a small notebook by his chair, filled with half-finished thoughts on history, math, and human behavior. Nobody touches that notebook, and nobody is invited to ask about it. Show the environment before you try to explain the personality, because the environment already explains it. His chair faces the window, not the television, positioned so he can think without being watched while thinking. His kitchen has exactly the tools he needs, and nothing performative sitting on the counter for show. His evenings follow a rhythm of reading, tinkering, and long stretches of comfortable, undemanded silence. This is a life built entirely around one quiet principle: control over his own mind, finally, after decades of not having it. If this already feels familiar, stay with me for the next few minutes, because the reason matters more than the routine. There is a short story behind that kind of privacy, and it deserves 15 honest minutes rather than a quick guess. Before we go further, it helps to actually understand where this pattern comes from, so stick around for that. But that still leaves the bigger question sitting underneath everything we just described. Why does this kind of quiet, guarded intelligence matter so much to a man like him? Where did the instinct to hide his own sharpness actually come from in the first place? What happened earlier in his life that made restraint feel safer than recognition? To understand that, you have to go back to the environment that shaped him before he ever had a place of his own. Because the adult you see today was built inside a much different, much harder world. Many black Gen X men grew up in households where intelligence was noticed early, sometimes by a single observant teacher. But that same intelligence often collided with underfunded schools, low expectations, and a system unprepared to nurture it. A lot of them were placed in gifted programs only to be pulled out weeks later without real explanation. Some were told directly by well-meaning adults to tone it down so other people wouldn't feel threatened. In certain families, being too smart in public could invite suspicion instead of praise from outsiders. For many, showing full intellectual confidence around white teachers or employers carried real, tangible risk. More often than people realize, brilliance had to be managed carefully, like a secret with serious consequences. What they grew up with was talent recognized in private, but rarely protected in public spaces. What they didn't have was a world that let that talent exist without a cost attached. What they learned to value, out of necessity, was discretion, timing, and emotional self-control. What they seek as adults is a space where intelligence doesn't need to be negotiated or minimized. When you grow up learning that visibility itself can be a risk, you carry that lesson quietly into every room you enter. That is where the psychology begins to make real, tangible sense. When someone spends decades adjusting their tone, their vocabulary, and even their posture to seem less threatening, restraint becomes a survival skill. Psychologists call part of this pattern code switching, but for many Black Gen X men, it went far deeper than language. It became a full internal system for managing how much of their intelligence the world was allowed to see. Over time, that constant calibration can produce something that looks like modesty, but is actually exhaustion. Hiding brilliance for long enough can eventually make quiet solitude feel like the only truly honest room in the house. Complex psychology should sound like a truth people already felt but never had words for, and this is exactly that truth. And this personal explanation appears in a broader pattern as well, not just in individual stories. Researchers studying identity and cognitive performance have long documented what is known as stereotype threat, the pressure of being seen through a narrow lens. Studies from psychologists, including Claude Steele, found that when Black students expected to be judged by racial stereotypes, performance and confidence could shift under that pressure alone. Historical data also shows that gifted and talented programs have long under-identified Black students relative to their actual test performance. Census and workforce research from recent decades consistently shows Black Gen X men entering professional fields while facing measurable wage and promotion gaps despite matching qualifications. The numbers begin to reveal a pattern that mirrors exactly what the story already suggested emotionally. But statistics cannot show you what that pattern actually feels like on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The data explains the shape of the pattern, but daily life shows you what it costs a person quietly. Picture him 30 years earlier, sitting in a meeting where he already solved the problem being debated. He waits, deliberately, letting a colleague arrive at the same conclusion 5 minutes later. He nods along, careful not to seem like he's correcting anyone, even though he clearly is. At home that evening, his notebook fills with the ideas he chose not to share out loud that day. On a Saturday, his grandson asks him a question about space, and his whole face changes instantly. For 20 unguarded minutes, he explains orbital mechanics with more excitement than he has shown all week. That is the version of him almost nobody at work has ever actually seen.
But there is another side of the story that deserves to be acknowledged honestly. And this is where we have to be honest about what can happen when a healthy habit is taken too far. Solitude built for peace can slowly turn into isolation built from old, unresolved fear. Discretion meant to protect someone can quietly harden into a wall that keeps everyone out completely. Some men in this same generation stopped sharing ideas altogether, even with people who genuinely wanted to hear them. Silence that once felt like control can eventually become the only emotional language a person has left. Self-protection, held onto for too many decades, can slowly turn into permanent emotional distance from the people who love him most. So the question is not really whether this behavior is good or whether it is bad. The real question is where healthy self-protection ends and quiet disconnection actually begins. The problem was never his intelligence, and it was never his preference for privacy either. The problem is when privacy becomes the only place where he ever feels safe enough to exist fully. The problem is not restraint itself, since restraint kept many of these men safe for decades. The problem is when restraint becomes so automatic that joy itself starts to feel dangerous to express. A mind that learned to hide for survival deserves, eventually, somewhere safe enough to be fully seen. So if you are the person being described right now, I want you to actually hear this part. If this sounds like you, there is something important I want you to remember clearly. What you built was never small, and it was never something to apologize for quietly. The discipline, the sharpness, the restraint, all of it kept you steady through rooms that were not built for you. Steadiness was never meant to be a permanent replacement for real connection. Keep 2 or 3 people close, the kind who would actually notice if you went quiet too long. The kind you could call at 2 in the morning without needing to explain yourself first. Let your grandson keep asking about space, and let yourself answer with your whole voice, not the managed version. You are allowed to take up the same room you always deserved without shrinking it down first. And maybe that is what most people miss when they look at someone like this. Because when you understand everything that came before, that opening scene starts to look different. That man at the kitchen table was never simply doing a crossword to pass empty time. He was practicing the one quiet freedom nobody could take from him decades ago, and never did. The pen instead of the pencil was never about carelessness or confidence for its own sake. It was proof, small and private, that some rooms in his life finally required no editing at all. Being alone at that table was never loneliness, and it was never emptiness either. It was, simply and finally, a mind resting in the one place it was never asked to shrink.